you've been praying. Maybe not as much as before, but you've been praying. You've been showing up to church, to your quiet time, to the moments where you bow your head and try. But something feels off. Not wrong exactly, just off. Like you're speaking into a room and the echo that used to come back isn't there anymore. And the most unsettling part isn't the silence. It's that you don't know when it started. You don't know what you did. You just know that God feels far away, and you can't explain why. That feeling has a name, and it has a reason, and neither one of them means what you're afraid they mean. Let's start with what it actually feels like, because this isn't the kind of distance that comes from walking away. You didn't storm off. You didn't decide to stop believing. This is quieter than that. More confusing than that. It's the feeling of going through the motions and noticing, somewhere in the middle of them, that the motions are all you have left. You pray, but the words feel thin. You read, but nothing lands the way it used to. You sit in a worship service and everyone around you seems to be feeling something you can't access, and you wonder if something is broken. In you, in your faith, in something you can't quite locate. And here's the part that makes it worse. You're not even angry. Anger would be easier to understand. Anger has edges. What you're feeling doesn't have edges. It's more like fog. A quiet, gray distance that you can't push against because you can't find where it starts. This is important, because most people assume spiritual distance means something dramatic happened. A crisis, a sin, a choice. But for a lot of people, maybe for you, nothing dramatic happened at all. It crept in, quietly. And that's actually one of the most disorienting versions of this experience, because there's nothing obvious to point to and fix. So what is actually happening? Here's what most people are never told. Your brain has a protective system, and it runs automatically, without asking your permission. When life becomes too much stress, too much grief, too much chronic pressure, your brain begins to mute your emotional experience, not just the hard emotions, all of them. It's a survival mechanism. Your nervous system essentially turns down the volume on feeling, because feeling everything at full intensity would be too costly to sustain. Psychologists call different versions of this emotional numbing dissociation, or what some researchers describe as emotional exhaustion. But you don't need the clinical terms. What you need to know is this. Your brain does this to protect you, and it doesn't ask which feelings you want to keep. It mutes the whole channel. And God, the way most of us experience God, lives on that channel. Think about it. The way you feel close to God is through emotion, through that sense of warmth in worship, that quiet knowing during prayer, that feeling in your chest when a verse reaches you somewhere deep. Those experiences are emotional experiences. They are real, they are meaningful, but they are processed through the same human nervous system that gets worn down, burnt out, and eventually goes quiet. So when life has been heavy long enough, when you've been carrying things without rest, without real support, without space to actually grieve what you've lost or process what's hurt you, your nervous system starts rationing, and the spiritual feeling often goes first, not because God withdrew, but because you are running on empty, and there is nothing left to feel with. But here's where it gets more specific and more personal. It's not just exhaustion. There's another layer, and it has to do with how human beings are wired for connection. Your brain doesn't just have a stress system. It has an attachment system, a deep, fundamental part of you that is wired to feel close to people and to feel when that closeness is threatened or lost. And here's what researchers have found. The way we relate to God emotionally tends to mirror the way we learned to relate to people, especially people we depended on early in life. If you learned, consciously or not, that closeness could disappear without warning, that people you needed became unavailable, that love was conditional or unpredictable, then some part of you learned to expect that from God too. Not theologically, not in your head, but in the place underneath your thoughts, in your nervous system, in the part of you that doesn't read scripture. It just feels. And sometimes, when life delivers something that echoes that old pain, a loss, a disappointment, a prayer that didn't go the way you hoped, that attachment system quietly pulls back. It protects itself the same way it always has, by creating distance before distance can be created for you. You may not have noticed it happening. Most people don't. But this is one of the most common, least talked about reasons people feel distant from God. Not rebellion, not doubt, an old wound quietly doing what it was taught to do. And this is where it gets important to say, it doesn't look the same for everyone. For some people, this distance feels like numbness, a flat gray spiritual life where nothing moves them anymore, and they're not even sure they mind. For others, it feels like longing, like standing outside a window looking in. They want to feel close, they remember feeling close, but they can't seem to get back there. For some people, it shows up as going through the motions so automatically that they don't even notice they've checked out. They still pray, they still attend, but they're not really there. And for some people, maybe for you, it started so gradually that you can't identify a before and after. There's no moment you can point to. Just a slow, quiet fading, like a light that dims so slowly you don't realize the room got darker until one day you can barely see. All of these are the same thing wearing different faces, and all of them are more common than anyone admits out loud. Which brings us to the part that probably needs to be said most. You have likely been carrying guilt about this. Some quiet, persistent voice that says this distance is your fault. That if you were more devoted, more disciplined, more spiritually mature, you would feel close to God. And because you don't, something must be wrong with you. That voice is wrong, and it's also understandable, because faith communities, with all the good they do, often unintentionally teach people that spiritual feeling is a measure of spiritual health. That closeness to God is something you produce through the right behaviors. So when the feeling disappears, the natural conclusion is that you must have done something wrong. But that is not what is happening. You are not drifting. You are depleted. There is a difference. Drifting is a choice, slow and directional, away from something you're turning your back on. Depletion is what happens to someone who has been giving, carrying, surviving, and holding it together for so long that they have nothing left, including the emotional bandwidth to feel a felt sense of God's presence. The distance you feel is not evidence of your failure. It may be evidence of how hard you have been trying to hold everything together. And here is something that faith itself has always known, even if it isn't always said clearly. This experience is ancient. It is not new to you, and it is not unique to you. David, the man Scripture calls a man after God's own heart, wrote words like this, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Not a man who stopped believing, a man who believed deeply and still cried out into what felt like silence. Elijah, after one of the greatest moments of his life, sat down under a tree and asked to die. Burned out, empty, unable to feel what he had felt before. And God's response was not a sermon. It was rest, food, presence without pressure. Even Christ, in his final hours, cried out in the language of felt abandonment, not because God had left, but because he was fully human, and being fully human sometimes means feeling exactly what you are feeling right now. The mystics of the church had a name for this. They called it the dark night of the soul. Not a punishment, not a sign of failure, a passage. A recognized, documented, spiritually significant experience that the deepest believers throughout history have walked through. You are not outside of faith when you feel this way. You may be further inside it than you realize. So here is where this ends. Not with instructions, not with a list of things to do to get the feeling back, just with this. The feeling of distance is not proof that God is gone. Feeling is not the same as fact. The warmth you once felt was real. The absence of it now is real. But absence of feeling has never been the same as absence of presence. The sky doesn't disappear when you can't see it through the clouds. The roots of a tree don't stop working in winter because there are no leaves. You are human. And being human means your capacity to feel, all of it, including the sacred, will have seasons, will have silences, will sometimes go so quiet you wonder if it was ever there. But the silence is not the answer. It is not the verdict on your faith, your worth, or your relationship with God. Sometimes the most honest, most profound thing a person can do is stay. Not because it feels like anything, not because the warmth came back, but because somewhere underneath the numbness, underneath the fog, underneath the exhaustion, something in you is still here, still reaching, still caring enough to wonder why the distance is there. And that something, that quiet, tired, still reaching part of you, has a name too. It's called faith.